Hey everyone, welcome back to another Technique Junkies video where today I'll be using 3 different stamps from Technique Junkies. 2 from the new release and 1 from a release a couple of months ago. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so here we go. We're going to be making this card. Now, I can't find my sparkly black paper, so I'm just going to use regular black paper for a matte layer. And then I've got a gray cardstock, and that's a top folding cardstock. So those two are going to go here, and we'll go ahead and work on the panel first. So I've got the Vintage French Advertisements, and I want to say it's from a release 2 or 3 months ago. I've got Distress Watercolor cardstock. I've got SDX227 Love You and S995 Open Heart. I'm going to be using some VersaFine Clair in, I want to say it's Morning Mist or something, picked raspberry in both an oxide and an ink, and also I'll be using the picked raspberry archival ink. I'm going to start with the Vintage French background, and I'm going to put the, and a piece of paper because I want to stamp off. I want this to be very, very light. I'll grab a piece of my watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to be using the smooth side. And I want watercolor because I'll be using a whole lot of water. And yeah, for this technique, I'm going to go ahead and put the gray ink down onto the stamp. And just make sure it's all good and inked up. And then I'm going to stamp off first with just a piece of plain copy paper. See, we got that stamped off, and then I'm going to go ahead and put my watercolor paper down and try and be steady with it. So I'm just pushing down. Now, this was a mistake because I end up moving my paper. You see that? Do-over. It didn't come out right. That's what happens, and I wanted to leave that in there just so you know that every one of us makes mistakes. And that's a good thing because you learn from them or you don't. If you're like me, you don't. You do it again. But this time I'm going to go ahead and stamp off again. And I can use this piece of paper as a background for a junk journal or whatever. And this time I'm going to try and be more steady, and I'm just going to push down on it. I am not going to rub. I don't want that paper moving on me. There we go. That's perfect. So I don't mind the little spaces around it because I will be trimming it down. And the reason that we use the VersaFine is I don't want a ink that will move with water. So I'm going to get out my Misty tool here, and I'm going to grab my Open Heart stamp, and I'm going to lay my printed background here down onto the Misty tool. I like that little cake down there at the bottom. It just kind of makes for the whole Sweet Valentine situation. And I'm going to lay this where I want it. And I'm remembering that I'm going to be trimming off some, so I want to get it kind of pretty centered. It doesn't have to be perfect because it's not a perfect shape. It's not an abstract. What would you call it? I don't know. Anyway, I'm going down with my picked raspberry oxide. You could use any colors you wanted, but you want to stay in the same color family pretty much. So, you know, if you're going to use the oxide, use the matching ink, use the matching archival. I'm going to leave my stamp in the platform, and then I'm going to pull this out, and I'm going to start spraying this with water because what I want is I want this ink to move around. But I want it to kind of, sort of stay in the shape. Kind of. Kind of, sort of. You know, it is going to move around because that's quite a bit of water. And then I'll go ahead and dab up anything off the sides, and I'm going to lay this onto a paper towel because when I dry it, it tends to get moisture up underneath. And then I'm just sort of moving this ink around. I need it to be very, very light. But you see, it still leaves the impression of the little hearts. So I'm going to go ahead and just dry this. And once I've got it dry, I'm going to put it back into my stamping platform. And here I'm going to use, I've got my archival ink still, and I have my distress ink in the picked raspberry. I'm going to put this right back down in the corner. Go ahead and magnet that down. And I'm going to wipe off any of the excess oxide, and I'm going to use the Distress ink this time. And I'm going to just saturate my stamp with the Picked Raspberry Distressed ink. And then I'm going to lightly spray it with water and stamp down. So this is going to leave sort of a wet, watery impression. I'm going to pull it out of my stamp platform and I'm going to dry it again. This time I'm not adding any extra water, but I do need it to be dry for the next step. I am just lightly spraying it with a little water. I'm not trying to saturate it or anything. Okay, we've got that one done and dry. Now I'm going to go in for the third layer. And I'm going to go ahead and just dab my stamp off, make sure there's no excess water on it. Put this piece of card panel back down into the corner of my MISTI. And then I'm going to grab the Picked Raspberry Archival. Now that won't move with water either. And that's the plan. Just stamp it down, get the ink, get it nice and inked up, and then I'm going to just press it down. Just give it some good presses here. And I'll tell you all, I'm making a lot of videos all at one time, so if my hands are inky, I'm so sorry. It is what it is. I'm just trying to get my work done on my day off. This is kind of my second job, so I like to get it done. Had a little piece of goober on there. Now I'm going to go ahead and wet this down again. So any of that Picked Raspberry ink can move around, and it's going to yet lighten it up and give it another coat of dimension or texture on the card. And that's what I'm looking for. But very light. And I'll just kind of move my water around, get some drips running. Wipe off my little glass mat here, and I'll go ahead and dry that. All right, so now it's all nice and dry, and I have trimmed it down to 5 by 3 3/4. Now I'm going to edge it with some hickory smoke because it's, you know, partly grungy. But it's not going to be your brown grunges. It's going to be your gray and black grunges. So I'm just going all the way around the whole edge, kind of boxing in the center part of this card panel. And I'm just using a small little blending brush to do this. And I'm still going to be doing some alterations, so don't panic. Trust the process. And I will be sewing on this card, so, and I won't show the sewing because I can't get my sewing machine in the right position to be able to film it. So you'll just have to trust me on that. So I'm going to get out my splat box here because now I want to add some splatters. And let me just grab a clean paper towel to lay in here. I'll lay this down, and I'm going to grab some white paint, and this is Distress paint in the picket fence. And I'm just going to put some of that white paint onto a little stamping block. Getting low on that, I'm going to have to buy some new. And then I'm going to add a couple of squirts of water to thin that down. And then I'll grab my fan brush and stir it all together and get my brush nice and wet. And then just tap the paint on. It's kind of hard to see in the camera, but it should be subtle because you've got a lot of white space already in this card. So I'm going to get a lot of nice splatters on there. Then I'm going to wipe off all my white, and then I'm going to go in with some black, just to kind of pull it all together. Now, I did not do the splatters in my prototype, and you guys will have to forgive me, but sometimes inspiration hits me after the fact. So I go with it. That's how I do art, and I really am getting that pretty wet. I'm going to splat some off to the side first because I don't want big, giant splatters of black. And I'm kind of just sticking towards around the edges. Of course, it's going to go everywhere, but I want the heavier portion out towards the edges. So now we've got our black splatters, and I want that to completely dry. It does need to be completely dry for the next step because I'll be adding a little bit more water. So now that this is dry, I'm going to just take my brush and basically get water around the edges. So I just spray water onto my mat, and my brush is still a little dirty, and that's okay, I don't mind. And I'm just kind of going around the edges with the splatters. Just to, because I want it all to match, and so I want to be able to pull up some of that hickory smoke ink. Or oxide, I should say. So I'm pulling that up, and there we go. Now we just want to make sure this is completely dry before we move on to the next step. And I'm just making sure that it's all nice and straight and flat. And then I'm going to be stamping the love you on there. So I'll grab my stamp platform. And I'll be using my Misty tool today. I have the Tim Holtz one too, but this one's just a little bit smaller, so it's easier to manipulate. And I've got a little piece of plastic acetate or whatever, and I'm just making sure that it's clean before I lay it down onto my card. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of lay this in the tool, grab the love you, make sure I have the correct orientation, and just kind of put it where I want it, which is right about in the middle of the heart. And then I'll pick it up with my stamping tool, and I can see just looking at it that it's a little bit crooked. So I'm just going to manipulate it here a little bit so it looks straight in my mind. And then I'll give it a single stamp on that acetate to make sure. And I'm happy with that, but then I moved my card. So you have to think about that, and I'm going to do over because I want this to be good. So I'll just wipe off that ink, and this time I'll put a magnet down on my paper itself so it doesn't move on me when I go to move my acetate. Now I'll check my placement. I still have ink on there, so that'll be fine. And I'm happy with my placement. So go ahead and magnet this down. I don't know why I didn't put it in the corner. Probably because I want you to be able to see it, and it's hard to get the whole thing in the camera view. So I'm just using VersaFine Clair to stamp this down. I'm not going to be embossing it or anything. Just making sure it's good and dark. And I'm going to give it one more for good measure. That is a beautiful, beautiful font. I love that font. Give it a push. And there we go. I'm happy with that. So I'll move my stamp platform so you can see where I am and what I'm doing here. And I'm very, very happy with that. Now I want to be careful not to smudge my ink, but I want to distress the edges of this. And so I just take my scissors. Oops, I just touched the love you. Luckily, I didn't smudge it. If you're smart, you will heat set that or let it dry. And let me just move this little grip mat because I hate trying to clean this stuff off the grip mat. And I just kind of scrape along the edge with the scissors. When you've used watercolor paper, and especially if you've used a lot of water with it, it really nicely does this. It almost makes it look like fabric. So I just go around, and I don't mind if I make little cuts in it because I'm trying to distress it. And just be careful that I don't touch my love you. And I do like these Tim Holtz scissors for this because they're just, they're serrated. And they really do a nice job of, kind of scraping up the paper. And it hasn't hurt my scissors yet. If it does, I'll buy some new ones. Not a big deal. I have one of those little tools, but I just prefer scissors for this. It's just easier, and not everybody has a tool like that. So what I like to do is I like to pull up all the paper so that it's pointed upwards. And I'm going to glue this down to my black mat, but I'm not going to glue all the way to the edges because I'm going to be sewing this and I really don't want to sew through glue. So I'll avoid the very edges and just put my glue, and I'm using art glitter glue for this. Just put my glue kind of inward. And you do, even if you're sewing it, you do want to glue, because sometimes if you don't, what'll happen is that middle paper, after you've sewn it, will want to rise up on you. At least that's been my experience. So I'm going to go ahead and push this down, and then I'm going to lay something flat and heavy on it for it to dry. And then I'll sew it together and I'll be back. All right, now I've got this all sewn down, and I've just sewn it with black thread, and I've popped it up on some foam tape, and I always like to pick up my card base to make sure it's not upside down. And then I'll just pull off the backing. And you could put more embellishments on here if you wanted to. I really didn't feel like it needed them. Because again, I'm the grunge person, so I'm standing up to make sure that I get this on straight. And then I'll just pop it down, and that's the card. Very easy, very beautiful. It's, you know, a little bit time consuming, of course, but, you know, it wouldn't be Technique Junkies if there wasn't some sort of technique involved, right? I hope you like this card, and if you do, please give me a thumbs up. Thank you so much for visiting my channel, and if you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing. And you can save 10% using my discount code TJ10Color at techniquejunkies.com. Bye-bye.